This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video we're going to continue learning how to read Greek. At this point you should be able to name all the letters of the Greek alphabet. You should be able to read each letter of the Greek alphabet. You should know the sound represented by each letter, and you should be able to read simple Greek syllables. If you haven't learned those lessons yet, please go back and continue studying those videos until you're ready. If you are ready, let's go ahead and get started. In this lesson, we will study the marks seen in Greek writing. If you look at the text here, which is verse 6 from chapter 1 of the Gospel of St. John, you can see the letters of the Greek alphabet, but you'll also see many different signs or markings on the letters as we go through. Some are simple punctuation marks, others look like apostrophes, others look like accent marks. In this video, we're going to learn what all of these different marks are and how they affect the reading of the Greek language. The first set of marks has to do with what's called aspiration or breathing. In Greek, aspiration is noted as follows. Aspiration or breathing is marked by an apostrophe, and if you look at the mark, it's shaped like a letter C. So remember, the mark that looks like an apostrophe and is shaped like a letter C is a mark of aspiration. Some teachers call it rough breathing, and it's equivalent to the letter H in English or Latin. So anytime we see this mark of aspiration over a vowel, we're going to read the sound of the letter H before that vowel. So if we look at this word here, we see Epsilon nu. If there were no marks on this syllable, we would read N, N. But when we see this aspiration mark shaped like a letter C, we add the sound of the letter H before the epsilon. And so this would correctly be read hen, hen. This is the aspiration mark that tells us to add a breath or rough breathing before this vowel. Here we see a second word that has a vowel marked with aspiration. So this would not be inna, but hinna, hinna, because the aspiration mark tells us to add rough breathing before this vowel. So this would be hen, and this would be hinna, because the aspiration mark is over the first vowel of the first syllable. There's also a mark used to show that there is no aspiration. Some teachers call this smooth breathing, and you see the aspiration mark here is like a backwards C. So if the mark looks like a backwards C, there is no aspiration, and we read it as if there was no mark at all. We just ignore this mark. This would be read as N, N, with no breathing. This hen, this N. Here we see the mark that shows soft breathing or no aspiration, and we read ide, ide. Not hide, but ide, with no rough breathing. Here we see hinna, with rough breathing. Here we see ide, with no rough breathing. These are the marks of aspiration, which we'll see in Greek reading. Here you can see the Greek letter alpha in its uppercase and lowercase form marked with aspiration. Notice that when uppercase letters are used, the aspiration mark is written before the letter. So this letter here with the aspiration mark would be read as ha, ha. The lowercase alpha here would be read ha, ha. Here you see the letter alpha in the uppercase with the mark of no aspiration or soft breathing, the backwards C, as it were. This would be read as ah, ah, with no breathing. Here the lowercase alpha with the mark of soft breathing is read ah, ah. Here we see the vowel epsilon with rough breathing. This would be read as he, he. Here we see the lowercase epsilon with the aspiration mark written above the letter. This would be read also as he, he. Here we see the uppercase epsilon with the mark of no aspiration, the backwards C, as it were. This will be read with no breathing as eh, eh. And the lowercase form also as eh, eh, with no rough breathing. Here we see the uppercase vowel eta, eta, and we see that rough breathing is noted with the aspiration mark. So this will be read as he, he. Likewise, the lowercase eta is also read he, he, with the aspiration mark above the lowercase vowel, before the uppercase vowel, above the lowercase vowel. Here we see the uppercase eta with the mark of soft breathing or no aspiration. This would be read simply as eh, eh. And the lowercase also with the mark above the vowel, eh, eh, no breathing. Here we see the Greek vowel iota with breathing or aspiration. This will be read as he, he. And the lowercase likewise, he, he. We see the aspiration mark shaped like a C, and that tells us to add breath before we pronounce this vowel, he. Here we see iota again with the mark of no aspiration or soft breathing. We read this as e, e, with no breath, e. And the lowercase likewise, e, e. Here we see the vowel omicron with rough breathing or aspiration. The aspiration mark is shaped like the letter C. This tells us again that we're going to add rough breathing before the sound of this vowel. This will be read as ho, ho, ho. And the lowercase likewise, ho, ho. Here we see the uppercase omicron with soft breathing marked. So we're going to read this vowel with no aspiration. O, o, o. And the lowercase likewise. O, o. Here we see the uppercase upsilon marked with rough breathing. This is going to be read as hu, hu, hu. And here the lowercase upsilon with rough breathing. Hu, hu. At the beginning of words, upsilon is never used without rough breathing, so we're not going to practice reading the upsilon with soft breathing. Here we see the vowel omega, the uppercase omega with rough breathing or aspiration. We're going to read this with the sound ho, ho. and the lowercase omega likewise. Ho, ho. Here we see the uppercase omega with soft breathing or no aspiration. The aspiration mark is like a backwards C, telling us there is no rough breathing. We'll read this as O, O, and the lowercase likewise as O, O, with no aspiration. Another letter that is marked with aspiration is the consonant ro. At the beginning of words, the letter ro is normally aspirated. So you'll see the consonant ro with aspiration. You can see this in English where we spell a word derived from Greek like rhetoric with the first two letters RH. That RH comes from this aspirated ro in Greek. So rather than reading this as r, we would actually read this as hra, hra, hra. That's the aspirated ro at the beginning of a Greek word. And you can see the lowercase form as well with the aspiration mark. Hra, hra, hra. So having studied aspiration, we now understand the first set of marks that we'll see when we read Greek words. The second set of marks come from Greek accents. There are 3 Greek accent marks. We see the names of the 3 marks here, and then the 3 marks that are used in the parentheses. The first accent mark is called the acute or sharp accent. Acute or sharp. And we see that the acute accent is marked by a short line that goes upwards from left to right, and it shows us that our pitch or the tone of our voice on that syllable should rise over our normal pitch. So the acute is a sharp accent, a rising accent, and it's marked with this rising symbol. So here, if we look at this word, we see that there's 2 syllables in this word, lo and gos. Lo and gos. But the first syllable has the acute accent mark. So when we read this word, we add or raise our pitch on this first syllable. So we'll read it not as logos, but logos, logos. We'll raise the pitch of our voice when we see the acute accent telling us to rise on this syllable. The second accent mark is called the grav, grav. Don't pronounce this as grave, it's grav. And this basically means a flat or falling pitch. You can see that the mark shows that we're falling as we read this syllable. So the grav accent is the opposite of the acute accent. The acute tells us to rise. The grav accent tells us to fall. Here we have the word theos, theos. And we see the grav accent telling us to fall in pitch on this second syllable. So we will not read it as theos. That's not right. We're not going to rise on the first syllable. We're going to read the first syllable with our normal voice and then fall on the second syllable to a flat or lower pitch. Theos, theos, theos. This is the mark of the grav accent. The third accent is called the circumflex. The circumflex. And the circumflex accent mark, which you can see here, sometimes the circumflex is marked by what's called a caret. You can look that up. It's on your keyboard. It's a symbol that shows a rise and a fall. like an upside down V. The circumflex, as I said, marks a rise and fall in pitch on the same syllable. So with the acute accent, we rise on one syllable and then come back down to normal on the next syllable. With the grave accent, we start with our normal pitch and then fall a bit to a lower pitch. With the circumflex accent, we rise and fall on the same syllable. So here you see the circumflex accent over the vowel eta at the end of this word. The first syllable is ar, and notice the soft breathing mark, ar, and the second syllable is ke, ke. But because we see this circumflex accent, we're going to read it as ke, ke, ke. We're going to rise and fall on that syllable. Arke, arke. This is the circumflex accent. So these are the other three marks that you'll see when you read Greek words. The acute accent, the grave accent, and the circumflex accent. If you look at this last word, arche, you'll notice that there's a small mark under the vowel eta. This mark looks like the vowel iota, and it is the vowel iota. To understand this mark, we need to learn about Greek diphthongs. So let's take a minute and learn the Greek diphthongs. A diphthong is a pair of vowels or vowel sounds that are treated as a single vowel sound in speech. A diphthong is a pair of vowels that are treated as a single vowel sound in speech. So when we see a diphthong, which is a special pair of vowels, we have to know to read that pair of vowels as a single sound or as a single syllable. So we have to know the diphthongs and be able to recognize them when we read Greek. In Greek, there are 12 diphthongs that we need to watch out for. There are 12 diphthongs. And remember, when we see these diphthongs, we have to remember to read them as a single syllable. Let's take a look at the 12 Greek diphthongs. Here we see the 12 Greek diphthongs, and you can see that they're set in 2 rows. You can see this top row is shaded with a darker color, and this bottom row is lighter. This is because these are 2 different kinds of diphthongs, and we learned this in Greek grammar. This first row of diphthongs are called proper or true diphthongs. The second row are called improper diphthongs, and I'll explain why in a bit. Let's look at each of these diphthongs one by one and learn how they're to be read in Greek. The first diphthong is made of the vowels alpha and iota. Alpha and iota. These vowels are read together as one syllable in Greek. So we would join them together and read I as one syllable. The second diphthong is made of the vowels alpha and upsilon. We read these together as one syllable in Greek. Au, au, au. The third diphthong is made of the vowels epsilon and iota. Epsilon and iota. And we read these together in Greek as a. The fourth diphthong is composed of the vowels epsilon and upsilon. We read them together as eu. The fifth diphthong is made of the vowels omicron and iota. Omicron and iota. We read them together in Greek as oi. oi, oi. The sixth diphthong is made of the vowels omicron and upsilon. Normally, this would be read with the sound O, O, O. But in modern Greek classes and textbooks, it's normally read with the sound oo, oo. So when you see this diphthong, remember to read it with the sound oo. You'll normally hear me read it with the sound oo. But if you want it to be perfect, it would be O, O. Remember, these 6 are the proper diphthongs. And the reason why they're called proper or true diphthongs is because we hear both of the sounds of the 2 vowels together in one syllable. These are the proper diphthongs. The improper diphthongs in the second row are called improper either because we don't hear both sounds when these diphthongs are read, or because they're just ugly sounds and the Greeks didn't like them. It's called cacophony, bad sounding speech. The first 3 are improper because only one sound is spoken. The last 3 are called improper because they do not sound good to the ear. They're not pleasant to speak or to hear. So these are called improper diphthongs. We can see the little mark underneath these 3 vowels, which we saw before we started studying the diphthongs. This mark actually is a little mark of the vowel iota. Originally, this diphthong was written alpha iota, just like we see up here. It was written alpha iota, but the iota was dropped from the pronunciation. But in order to remember that it actually was alpha iota, that iota was written under the vowel like this. This is called iota subscript. Iota subscript. That means a iota written under the vowel. And these 2 marks should be understood to represent a diphthong, but only the alpha is read. So this diphthong, alpha with iota subscript, is read with the single sound, ah, ah. The same is true with this diphthong. We see the vowel eta, and it was followed by a iota, but that iota has been dropped from pronunciation and written under the eta just to mark its existence. So when we see this diphthong, the letter eta with iota subscript, we read it with the sound of the eta alone. E, e. And this is true also of the diphthong omega with iota subscript. We read just the sound of the omega. O, o. So these 3 diphthongs, we read only one of the vowels, but they're still considered diphthongs, and that's marked by the iota written under to remind us that it formerly followed the other vowel. The last 3 diphthongs, as I said, are called improper because they don't follow the rules of Greek euphony. They aren't pleasant to speak or to hear. Here we see the vowel eta followed by the vowel upsilon, and this would be read as eu, eu. And you can see it's difficult to pronounce. Imagine pronouncing that in the middle of a word, especially because the eta is long. To make the long vowel sound and then shift to the upsilon is difficult to pronounce, and it's not very pleasant to hear. Eu, eu, pronounced as a single sound together. Next we have upsilon and iota. Upsilon, u, then moving to the iota, ui, ui. You can see it's not a pleasant sound, and that's why it's called an improper diphthong, ui. And lastly, omega upsilon, omega upsilon. The sound of the omega, o, with the sound of the upsilon added at the end. O, o. You can see that that's a difficult pair of sounds to read together, and it's not pleasant to listen to. Again, that's why these last three are called improper diphthongs. So these are the 12 Greek diphthongs, and the reason why we're learning them in this lesson is because they show us the meaning of these marks that we see here, the iota subscript. So to understand more clearly the importance of being able to identify the 12 Greek diphthongs, let's look at some words that show us pairs of vowels, some of which are diphthongs and some of which are not diphthongs. You can read here, in Greek there are 12 diphthongs. All other pairs or groups, because sometimes there can even be three vowels, maybe even more. We'll see one word where there's 4 vowels in a row. All other pairs or groups of vowels should be read as separate syllables. So we have to be able to identify the 12 diphthongs because we're always going to read them together as a single syllable, but other groups of vowels we're going to divide. So let's look at this first word. We see the first syllable is the, and the second syllable is os. We have a pair of vowels in the middle of this word, epsilon and omicron. But epsilon, omicron do not make one of the 12 Greek diphthongs, so this word is divided into 2 syllables between those 2 vowels. And we would read this as theos, theos. Notice the grave accent telling us to fall down in pitch, theos. In this second word, we see omicron upsilon, and that is a Greek diphthong. So they're kept together as a single syllable. You can see that rough breathing is added and a circumflex accent. So we would read this as hu, and the second syllable as tos. This word is read hu, tos. 2 syllables, even though there are 3 vowels, because these 2 vowels are a Greek diphthong, and they're kept together as 1 syllable. The next word, we have zeta, omega, and eta. So we have 2 vowels together in the word, but they do not form a Greek diphthong. So we separate them into 2 separate syllables, zo-e, zo-e. And you can see again the grave accent telling us to fall down on the second syllable, zo-e. In this fourth example, we see the vowels iota and alpha together in the word, but they do not form a diphthong. And so we separate this word into 2 syllables between those 2 vowels, and we say di-a, di-a. Notice again the grave accent telling us to fall on the second syllable, di-a. Next, we have alpha, upsilon, tau, and omega with a iota subscript. Alpha upsilon is a Greek diphthong, and so we keep them together in 1 syllable. Omega with iota subscript is also a diphthong. We read these together. Notice the mark that there is no aspiration. Au, au, to. Notice the circumflex accent. Rise and fall. To, to. Au, to. Next we have a longer word, a, le, the, as. A, le, the, as. And here in the word we have three vowels together, epsilon, iota, and alpha. Epsilon and iota form a diphthong, so they're kept together in one syllable. The alpha does not form a diphthong with iota, so we separate these two vowels into separate syllables. Notice the soft breathing, no aspiration over the alpha, a, le. Then we have theta and the diphthong, the, and as. Notice here we have an acute accent, so it tells us to rise in pitch on this syllable. A, le, the, as. A, le, the, as. And lastly, a longer word, we have pi and iota, sigma, tau, epsilon, upsilon, omicron, upsilon, sigma, iota, nu. Here we see that we have four vowels in a row, all together in the Greek word. Epsilon, upsilon, omicron, upsilon. So we have four vowels together in this word. Epsilon, upsilon, however, form a diphthong, so they're kept together and treated as a single vowel sound. Omicron, upsilon also form a diphthong, so they're kept together and treated as a single vowel sound. So we read pi, steu, steu, u, sin. Pi, steu, u, sin, with two diphthongs. Notice also an acute accent tells us to rise in pitch on this syllable. Pi, steu, su, or sorry, pi, steu, u, sin. Pi, steu, u, sin. One thing to note that I practiced when reading the diphthongs in the previous slide, but I want you to notice here more clearly, is that aspiration and accent marks are placed over the second vowel of a diphthong. Aspiration marks and accent marks are placed over the second vowel of a diphthong. So notice here, for example, we have a diphthong made of the vowels omicron and upsilon. Normally, the aspiration mark would be over the first vowel, the first letter of the word. But because these two vowels form a diphthong, the aspiration mark with its accent is actually placed over the second vowel of the diphthong. That helps us to see that these two vowels form a diphthong. We see that here. We also see it here. We see alpha upsilon diphthong with the soft breathing mark over the second vowel of the diphthong. We also see that here. Epsilon iota with the acute accent mark written over the second vowel of the diphthong. And lastly, we see it here. Epsilon upsilon with the acute accent mark written over the second vowel of the diphthong. So the aspiration and accent marks are placed over the second vowel of a diphthong in Greek words. That should help you understand why the marks are where they are when you see them marking a diphthong. Next, we should consider punctuation marks that are used in Greek. Three of these are like English punctuation marks, and one of them is different. The comma in Greek is just like a comma in English. The period in Greek is just like a period in English. A colon is just like a colon in English, but a question mark is written as a semicolon. So what would look like a semicolon in English is a question mark in Greek. This is a question mark in Greek. These are the Greek punctuation marks. The last thing to be noted before we start reading is that in Greek, when the letter gamma is doubled in speech, it is read as follows. Here we see this word alpha, gamma, gamma. So here's a double gamma. Alpha, gamma, gamma, epsilon, lambda, omicron, sigma. If we read this following normal Greek phonics rules, we would read ag-gelos, ag-gelos. And that's difficult to say, so the Greeks simplify it. They do not read it as two gammas, but change the first gamma to make the sound of the consonant nu. And we read this not as ag-gelos, but we read an-gelos, an-gelos. So the double gamma is not read ag-gelos, but angelos, angelos. And notice we have a rough breathing mark, no aspiration, followed by an acute accent mark. So we have no breathing on this first sound, and we rise in pitch on this first syllable. Angelos, angelos. Now, having learned all of these marks in Greek, we can now look at Greek text, and even though it looks crazy with letters and marks all over the place, we can work letter by letter, word by word, and understand what we actually see. Let's begin up top here at the beginning of this passage. And this is verses 1 through 5 from the Gospel of St. John, chapter 1, which you'll read in Greek reading. This first word, we see an uppercase epsilon with a soft breathing mark before it. We read this as N, N. Epsilon with soft breathing. In the second word, we see alpha with soft breathing. And then at the end of the word, we see the eta, iota diphthong with iota subscript, and we see a circumflex accent over that diphthong. So we have no breathing at the beginning of the word, and we have a circumflex accent on the last syllable. We rise and fall on this syllable. Arche, arche. In the next word, we have the vowel eta with soft breathing and a circumflex accent. So we read this as ein, ein. Rise and fall on the syllable with no breathing. Ein, ein. Next we have the omicron with rough breathing. We see the aspiration mark shaped like a C. This means we're going to add breath before this omicron and read this as ho, ho, ho. Next we have the word logos, but we have an acute accent over the first syllable. So we're going to rise in pitch on the first syllable. Logos, logos. And we see a simple comma here. En arche ein ho logos, comma. Next we have the Greek word kai, and we see a diphthong here with an accent mark over the second vowel of the diphthong. This is a grave accent, so this word, since it's one syllable, is going to be spoken with a lower pitch than our normal speech. En arche ein ho logos kai. You hear the drop in pitch marked by the grave accent. We then again have Omicron with rough breathing, ho. And we again have the word logos, the acute accent, lo, rising, and then gos, logos. We then again have the word ein, soft breathing over the eta with a circumflex accent, ein. We then have the word pros, pros, and we see a grave accent telling us to lower the pitch, pros, pros. We then have ton with a grave accent telling us to flatten or lower the pitch, ton, ton. We then have the word theon with an acute accent. Notice we have two vowels together, but they are not a Greek diphthong, so we divide this word into two syllables. Theon, 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 with the acute accent. We then have kai again. Then we have another form of this same word with a grave accent on the second syllable. Remember, these do not make a diphthong, so we divide this word into two syllables. Theos, theos. Notice how we fall on the second syllable. Kai theos. We then again have the word ein, ho, logos. In verse 2 we have omicron and upsilon, which form a diphthong. That's why the aspiration mark and the accent are written over the second vowel, because this forms a diphthong. We read this as hu, hu. The rough breathing puts the breath at the beginning, and the circumflex reads with a rise and a fall. Hu, hu, tos, hu, tos. We then have ein, ein. We then have epsilon and nu with no breathing. Note that this is the same word that we saw at the beginning of the sentence, except here we saw an uppercase epsilon, and here we see a lowercase epsilon. En, en, with no breath. En. We then have arche again. We saw that before, the second word of the passage. Arche, arche. Pros, ton, theon, theon. Acute accent and a period ending verse 2. We then have panta, panta, and you can hear the acute accent, panta. We then have d. Now this mark here is actually an apostrophe because this word is dia, and the second vowel, the alpha, has been dropped. So this is actually just a mark that shows that the alpha in dia has been dropped. And the reason why it's been dropped is because the next word starts with the sound a. So instead of saying dia, a, they just drop the alpha and say dia. So that mark there is just an apostrophe showing that a letter has been dropped. And you'll see that in the exposition of the Greek reading lesson. Here we have a diphthong, alpha, upsilon, marked with no breathing. We read this as au. Here we have another diphthong, omicron, upsilon, with a circumflex accent. So we're going to rise and fall on this second syllable. Au, tu, au, tu. Next we have an epsilon with soft breathing, e, e. We then have an acute accent, ege, neto, ege, neto, followed by a comma. We then have kai with a grave accent. We then have the word choris, choris, and you see a grave accent telling us to fall, choris, choris. We then again have autu, autu, a diphthong with no breathing, and another diphthong with a circumflex accent. Autu, autu. Ege, neto, ege, neto. We then have u, de, u, de. U here, omicron upsilon, is a diphthong with no breathing. Oops, sorry. Let me back up. Next we have hen. We see rough breathing with an acute accent. Notice this is epsilon nu, epsilon nu. Just like this word here, epsilon nu, epsilon nu. Here we see no breathing. We see an aspiration mark that looks like a backward C that tells us there's no breathing, and we read this as N. With this word, we see that there is aspiration. This is a different word. The difference is in the aspiration. So here we're going to add rough breathing before the sound of the epsilon, and in the reading of this sentence, we're going to read this with a rise in pitch marked by the acute accent. So this is going to be read hen, hen, hen. We then see omicron with rough breathing and a grave accent, so we're going to fall on this word. Hen, ho, hen, ho. Gegonen, gegonen. Acute accent on the epsilon. We then see the word en again with no breathing, en. Here we see au to, au to. We have the diphthong alpha upsilon marked with no breathing, au. And then we have the diphthong omega with iota subscript with a circumflex accent, telling us to rise and fall on this second syllable. Au to, au to. We then have zoe, zoe. And notice that omega and eta do not form a diphthong, so this word is divided into two syllables. Zoe, with the grave accent on the second syllable. Zoe. We then have ein, again, ein. Kai, he, notice the rough breathing mark, the aspiration mark shaped like a C. He, he. Zoe, zoe. Ein, to, phos, phos. Circumflex accent on the omega, rise and fall. Phos, phos. And again, circumflex accent on the omega, ton, ton. And here we have a long word with an alpha at the beginning with no breathing, an. Then we have thro, notice the acute accent, thro, and then pon, anthropon, anthropon. Verse 5, we have kai, ta, phos, phos, en, te. Notice we have the diphthong, eta, with iota subscript. That's our diphthong, marked with a circumflex accent. Te, te. We then have scotia, scotia. And here we basically have three vowels in a row. Iota, alpha, iota. The iota at the end is dropped as a iota subscript, showing that these two vowels form a diphthong and the iota is not spoken. These two vowels, iota and alpha, do not form a diphthong, so we divide this word in between these two vowels to form separate syllables. Sco-ti-a, sco-ti-a. We then have the diphthong alpha iota, so that's treated as one syllable. And we have the diphthong epsilon iota, so that's treated as one syllable. This first syllable is marked with an acute accent. Phi, ne, phi, ne. Kai, he, scotia, scotia. Diphthong alpha upsilon with soft breathing over the second vowel of the diphthong, Au, to. Au, to. Grave accent. Then we have the diphthong omicron upsilon with no breathing. U. And lastly, ka, te, la, ben. Ka, te, la, ben. Ka, te, la, ben. Followed by a period to end the passage. So there we've looked at every single mark on the first 5 verses of the Gospel of St. John, and you can see that we've explained everything that you're going to see in the reading in this lesson. So that's a lot of information, and you're going to want to review this video a number of times until you master all these marks that are used in Greek. But that's everything you need to know to read Greek. And this is going to be the last video in this series on how to read Greek.